This video is all about how I made my two petticoats that go over my 1860s hoop skirt, which is what formed the structure of my wedding gown skirt. I will link the video about making my hoop skirt above and below. The base petticoat with 5 ruffles is to smooth out the hoop skirt ridges. The final petticoat is mainly smooth with just 1 ruffle along the bottom edge. The 2 petticoats have their openings on either sides of the body to spread the bulk. Both waistbands are flat at the front, sit smoothly and low down under the arrow hook, and move volume away from the waist. They both gather at the back for size adjustability, with the gathering ties on opposite sides. I started the creation process by drafting the waistbands. I lined up a piece of paper to the centre front, sketched on an initial idea of how the front should look, and played around with it until I had a waistband front pattern piece. I decided to make the base petticoat waistband 3 inches deep and the top petticoat 1.5 inches deep. I measured the back, both at the waist, 17 inches, and at the bottom of where the waistband would go, 22 inches. To allow room and gathering at the back, I decided to make the back of each waistband a rectangle 26 inches long, plus seam allowance and placket. I had 2 pieces of cotton voile folded to give 4 layers. I added seam allowance to my pattern and cut each on the fold, giving both the outer and the lining of the front waistband pieces for both petticoats. I also cut the rectangles for the back of the waistbands. I stitched the outer and lining front pieces of each waistband together along the top edge and down one side. I clipped the seam allowance and pressed open, then pressed right sides out. We can see the 2 waistbands with the closures planned for opposite sides, and the back rectangles have been pressed in half lengthways. I then marked seam allowance and placket placement, as well as the buttonhole locations for the gathering tapes. I added the buttonholes with 1 layer rolled out of the way. I do like the way that this machine can do buttonholes. A total of 4 buttonholes sewn, ready for the gathering tapes. With right sides together, I pinned the fronts to the backs for both the waistbands. I stitched those seams and also closed the other end of the back pieces. Now each waistband was a single piece, with the openings and buttonholes for the gatherings on opposite sides to spread the bulk. I inserted the gathering tapes and pinned them into place, 1 tape coming from each side of each waistband. I top stitched along the front of the waistband, secured the end of the tape, then carefully stitched the channel for the tape, allowing the tape to run free within the channel. Success! With that, both petticoat waistbands were prepared. And here is the wider waistband sitting on Madam, my dress form. The smooth front held down under the arrow hook and the back gathered in. My plan for the ruffled petticoat was for the base to sit fairly snugly to the cage, then ruffles over the top to smooth it all out. For the front panel, the centre front needs to be 63 centimetres. The side is 72 centimetres. The front is 7 centimetres lower than the side. The front width will be 45 centimetres, gathered into 30 centimetres. The bottom width should be 72 centimetres. For the back panels, the side is 72 centimetres long and the back is 88 centimetres. The bottom edge needs to be 120 centimetres wide. At halfway up, it should be 80 centimetres wide. 3/4 of the way up should be 55 centimetres wide. So I'll cut the top to 55 centimetres plus seam allowance, which will gather in at the waistband. This gives more than the needed 88 centimetres of length along the angle for the centre back. I ripped off 3 pieces of cotton voile 80 centimetres deep. This will be my front piece, so I folded it in half, cut my side of the trapezoid, then cut down the waist for the front dip. Then I laid out the other 2 pieces of fabric together for the 2 back pieces and cut the angle into them. After sewing just the centre back seam, I laid the back piece on Madam, then the front piece, and I was happy to proceed. There was enough fabric to cover the hoop, but not vast amounts beyond that. I laid out the back and laid the front on top, pinning the side seam, which I then sewed. I then laid the other side seam together, pinning that and marking where the opening goes down to at the top. Next, I cut out a placket piece, which I folded over and overlocked at one end, then turned right side out and overlocked the long edge. I pressed the side seam of the petticoat open, pinned on the placket, then stitched and pressed, finishing by top stitching along both sides of the seam. With that, the base layer of the petticoat was all in one piece. The next step was to mark the front and back locations of where the ruffles will be attached. The ruffles will be spaced 20 centimetres apart along the centre back. I measured how long each ruffle needed to be. And I double-checked that the waistband had a total length less than the top of the petticoat base. Then I calculated how long each ruffle would need to be with 2 times fullness to the gathering. I had a piece of cotton voile 6 meters long and 145 centimeters wide. I tore this into 5 even strips, each 29 centimeters wide. Then I pressed each strip, which did take a fair bit of time and effort. Huzzah! All 5 were smooth. I measured and cut off 4 meters for the upper ruffle. I used a rolled hem foot to hem the bottom edge of the ruffle. I find it best to really roll the edge in before feeding it into the machine, and to support the fabric as it goes in. I find this method gives a nice, neat edge. I also did the same on the short sides of the ruffle, as these will be open at the side of the petticoat. I put in 2 lines of gathering stitches into the top of the upper ruffle. And I also put 2 lines of gathering stitches along the top of the base layer of the petticoat. I gathered the ruffle and pinned it to the waistband, which I basted together. I then gathered the base layer of the petticoat and pinned that on too. I stitched the 3 layers together securely, and I overlocked the seam to keep it all neat. Then I folded under the waistband lining and pinned it down. I top stitched along the waistband to keep it all in place. With the top ruffle and waistband attached, I hung the petticoat on Madame to let the fabric relax and for any bias to stretch out. The upper ruffle was done. For the remainder of the ruffles, I decided to use the ruffle foot rather than gathering by hand, so I adjusted it so it had fairly minimal gathering. After hemming, as previously shown, I threaded the fabric into the foot, and then I just stitched, and the foot did all the work. The key is to keep the fabric feeding in straight. My first ruffle from the ruffle foot was only just long enough to make it around ruffle 2, which was fine. After that, I adjusted the stitch length to be less ruffled still. The looser gathering of the ruffle foot meant I had a bit under 2 times gathering, but that was still plenty of fullness. I had all 4 remaining ruffles ruffled. I marked the bottom edge of the petticoat along the top edge of the bag of the hoop skirt with a line of pins. I laid it out and averaged the pins from each side. Then I cut off the excess. I started to pin a long ruffle to the bottom edge of the petticoat, but I decided to switch to just holding the layers together once I was going and sewing them together with the overlocker. Once I was nearly back at the start, I snipped and tore off my excess, then overlocked the short edges of the ruffle together. Then finished attaching the ruffle to the bottom of the petticoat. Like so. I laid out the petticoat and marked the locations for the 3 remaining ruffles, first with pins, then with pencil. I turned it over and marked the other side as well, then removed the pins. I laid on ruffle 4 where I had marked it and put in a couple of pins at the start. Then I stitched on the ruffle with a simple top stitch. When I was back to near the start, I trimmed off the excess, I aligned the 2 short sides and overlocked them together. I pinned down the final section and stitched, finishing the ruffle. I did the same process with ruffle 3, at which point 4 of the 5 ruffles were on. Ruffle 2 begins and ends at the side opening, so next I needed to finish the first side edge with a rolled hem. After that, I top stitched the ruffle on and tore off at the required point once it was long enough. I rolled hemmed the final short edge and stitched the final portion of the ruffle to the petticoat. I stitched on 2 hook and bars to the waistband, and the ruffled petticoat was complete. For the smooth petticoat, I wanted just one big piece of fabric gathered into the waistband and 1 ruffle at the bottom. I overlocked the edges of my cotton voile and pinned them together, marking 30 centimeters from the top to leave open. I stitched the seam. I pressed the seam open, including the top opening. I prepared a second placket. I top stitched the seam allowance, which also stitched in the placket. I stitched 2 long lines of gathering stitches along the top. I gathered the top of the petticoat into the waistband, putting 150 centimeters into the front and the rest of the volume into the back. I stitched to secure the layers together. Then I overlocked that edge, then folded under the edge of the inside layer of the waistband, as I had done for the ruffled petticoat. Then I top stitched that in place. I added in the hooks and bars to this waistband, at which point it was looking like this. I marked 300mm off the floor. I averaged each half, and then I cut off the excess. From the scrap, I tore it off so that I had one long, even rectangle. Then I tore it in half to create two 22cm wide strips. I hemmed the bottom edge of each strip, then gathered the top edge with the ruffle foot. At this point, I had two ruffles, so I joined them together and used the overlocker to sew the ruffle onto the bottom of the smooth petticoat. For the wedding, I also added a small train section to the back of the smooth petticoat, but I'll discuss that further in my wedding skirt video. I am very happy with how these two petticoats came out, so floofy and delightful, creating a smooth base for my wedding skirts. And simultaneously being now ready for any future 1860s outfits. My 1860s undergarments were all complete.